criminal acts are as old as humanity itself. They tell tales of anger and hatred, greed and suffering, death and depravity. Nothing affords us a deeper look into the sinister depths of a past epoch than the crimes committed during it. Many criminal cases of the distant past still remain unsolved today. No one had the tools to detect the perpetrators, but what was then impossible can now be done. Today's cutting-edge forensic science offers methods for solving many cold cases of antiquity. High-tech diagnostic and forensic procedures help to solve crimes that for centuries had left people scratching their heads. Arsonists are identified, conspirators convicted, and murderers unmasked. The perpetrators may be long dead, but their crimes live on. In this episode, we look at a mysterious assassination, a gruesome execution, and a brutal massacre. A famous pharaoh fell victim to a conspiracy. Nothing less than the seat of Egyptian power was at stake. The Valley of the Kings in ancient Egypt. It was the period known as the New Kingdom, the era of the great pharaohs. The last one of them died in the year 1156 BC, Ramses III. He had ruled Egypt for over 30 years. As a field commander, the pharaoh had fought the incursion of foreign peoples, and to cement his legacy, he had erected a series of monumental temples.
Ramses III was one of the last pharaohs to initiate really large-scale buildings in the New Kingdom. And one of his most memorable temples is his funerary temple, his temple of millions of years, which is at Medina Tabu in western Thebes.
The funerary temple still stands today. The complex gives a vivid impression of the great size and magnificence of the shrines in pharaonic Egypt. When Ramses III was laid to rest here more than 3,000 years ago, there was no indication that he had died an unnatural death. But modern forensic examinations of the mummy have now revealed evidence of a different scenario. Was Ramses III murdered?
Although he was a great builder and a warrior, people were not totally happy with him as king because his reign was not without trouble. And so people must have been suffering. They were suffering about food, they were suffering about security. So really it was a time of great tenseness.
The high-risk sites of the royal building projects became hotspots of dissent. Working conditions were severe and accidents an everyday occurrence. That fomented rebellion amongst the workers. Some began to doubt the wisdom of the great pharaoh. But just how far did the temple builders' anger go? An answer can be found at the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy, home to one of the world's foremost collections of ancient Egyptian papyri. No one knows the contents of these records better than German curator Susanne Töpfer. That includes an exceptionally important papyrus dating from the era of Ramses III.
There's writing on the entire papyrus, front and back. This is the front side, but there's writing on the back as well. Right at the beginning here, it's reported that the workers went on strike because they didn't get their rations, grain in particular. They didn't go to work. They approached the authorities and lodged a complaint.
The papyrus gives us the oldest source of a workers' strike in the recorded history of humanity. An action aimed directly at the pharaoh.
Ramses III was the first person in history to ever have to deal with a sit-in strike. So the workmen of the Valley of the Kings were not being paid, so they all marched to his temple and said, "We will sit here until we get paid."
The temple workers demanded to be paid in kind, as was customary at the time. How would Ramses react?
First, 55 loaves of bread were dispensed. Later, the grain and vegetable rations, also fish, water, drinking water, were given to the laborers.
Once the demands of the temple builders had been met, they returned to their labors. Social equilibrium had returned to the kingdom on the Nile. But 3 years later, the temple builders again took strike action. This is also documented in the papyrus, but this time it wasn't about unpaid wages or the lack of food supplies.
It states here quite clearly that they did not wish to issue a complaint because they were hungry. Rather, they wanted to complain of an injustice that had occurred. They wanted to go before the pharaoh to report an injustice. Some Egyptologist colleagues interpret this reference as possible foreknowledge of a plot to assassinate Ramses III.
A premeditated assassination of Ramses III. In whose interest would that have been? Here, too, the papyrus from the Museo Egizio collection offered insight. It documents a conspiracy against the pharaoh and even names the ringleaders.
This papyrus speaks of the women in the harem but does not exactly say what happened. It's actually more of a list of the conspirators.
But what motive did the conspirators have? And why does the papyrus so pointedly name them as women of the harem? As all pharaohs, Ramses III had multiple wives, who all lived in a separate tract of the palace.
When there is more than one wife and more than one child, there are bound to be rivalries and jealousies and desire for power. So after reigning for 30 years, it was clear that this was definitely a time the king must have his successor appointed.
So it was about succession to the throne. But Ramses III had not specified which of his many sons from many different wives should be his heir. A relief in the funerary temple of the pharaoh depicts a presentation of all sons deemed eligible to succeed to the throne, 13 princes in all. But Ramses III neglected to have the name and rank in line for the throne carved under the images of the boys. The procession of the princes still shows us no more than a series of potential successors. But the mother of one of the princes determined to help her son ascend the throne.
One of Ramses's secondary wives, Queen Tia, decided that she wanted her son, Pentawer, to be king, and so she plotted the assassination of her husband so that her son could rule all of Egypt.
But who else was in on the treacherous conspiracy to eliminate the pharaoh?
The conspiracy to kill Ramses III was quite complex, as it would have to be. So really, it was penetrating every little nook and cranny of the palace infrastructure, as well as people outside, because the plan was to not just kill the king, but cause an insurrection outside. And then Pentawer was supposed to step in and take over and sort of grab hold and control of the entire country.
So the assassination of Ramses III would be nothing less than a sweeping political takeover.
It was a very large pack of conspirators, which shows how unpopular this pharaoh was in his lifetime.
The motive of the conspirators is clear. Dissatisfied with the pharaoh's leadership, they wanted to overthrow him. For the assassination itself, they chose a special event.
The beautiful Festival of the Valley was originally a burial rite at the necropolis. But by the time of Ramses III, things had changed and had become known as a festival of drunkenness.
While the people drank and made merry, the pharaoh embarked on a boat ride, a symbolic journey to the realm of the dead. Accompanied by high priests, he crossed the Nile. But Ramses III still did not suspect that assassins lay in wait for him on the other side.
The plan to assassinate Ramses III did not just focus on killing him, but it involved other things, including magic. This is perhaps why priests were involved. There seems to have been some kind of magical spells and perhaps also poisons or something involved in his death.
In an act of ritual sacrifice, the conspirators offered wax figurines to the fire. This voodoo magic was presumably meant to weaken the pharaoh's resistance. All systems were now go for the assassination, but apparently word of the conspiracy had leaked out at the last minute. At least, that is the court report found in the Turin papyrus. The conspirators were brought before a special tribunal. The chief prosecutor was Ramses III himself. The court sentenced all assassins and their co-conspirators to severe sentences.
The ones who were very noble were allowed to commit suicide. Others were killed. They were even impaled. And still others were just punished. Either they had their feet beaten, and many of them had cuts, so their noses, ears, lips, etc. would be cut off, which was a common kind of punishment for evildoers in ancient Egypt.
That's the official version of the failed assassination attempt, as recorded after the pharaoh's death in Egyptian papyri. But did Ramses III really survive the assassination? In 2012, an international research team subjected the mummy of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh to its first ever examination with modern imaging technology. Bolzano mummy researcher Albert Sink was instrumental in that spectacular study of the pharaoh's mummified remains.
All we had up till then were X-rays of the mummy, and we hoped that with the new imaging methods, computer tomography, we'd gain fresh insight, especially into the death of Ramses III.
The results of the computer tomographic analysis were a sensation. They shed a completely new light on the case.
The CT images show quite clearly that Ramses III received a very deep cut to the throat area while he was still alive. The stab wound goes all the way to the bone, and it's a clear indication that it was fatal for Ramses III. His throat was literally slit through. And we can also see that afterwards an attempt was made during the mummification process to heal this wound for the afterlife.
The computer tomography images contradicted the theory that the assassination plot against Ramses III was foiled. On the contrary, it appeared the assassins had in fact ended the pharaoh's life with a single, well-executed slit of the throat.
He must have spurted out with blood. This is a very forceful wound. It must have been done by someone who was quite strong, presumably from the back. Did they hold his head back and then make a cut? These are all questions we have, but certainly there's a feeling that you must have had his head pulled back in getting his throat to be so exposed for such a gash to be made.
And the CT scans revealed something else as well. When embalming the murdered pharaoh, the ancient mortician had given the mummy an amulet.
There was an amulet placed here. And this amulet was the Eye of Horus, which is a healing amulet. And so putting it here meant that there was an effort being made to heal this, so that in the afterlife, the king would be whole and complete.
In the Egyptian belief system, the pharaoh's physical injuries had to be mended before his body could be sent on to the realm of the dead. This was a criterion for a dignified funeral. But what happened to the corpses of the assassins? Where were they buried?
Amongst the royal mummies that were retrieved in the 19th century, there was one very enigmatic body. It was called Unknown Man E, and it was unlike any other mummy because it was not properly mummified. The face was in a horrible scream. Recent work carried out in Egypt has suggested that maybe this is the body of Pentawer, the son of Ramses III and possibly the murderer of Ramses III.
But was the mummy really that of Ramses' son? Modern forensic science can deliver an answer. To this end, microbiologists did a DNA comparison. All they needed as a sample were minuscule amounts of body cells, which can still be taken from millennia-old Egyptian mummies today. This cellular material is the key to the DNA of the dead.
Within our genome, we have sequences that are unique for every person. And because one half is inherited from our mother, the other half from our father, we can just use these unique sequences by comparing them to the person in question.
Carrying out a genetic paternity test involves STR analysis. STR stands for short tandem repeats, the term for a repetitive pattern of short base pairs within a strand of DNA. In a parental test, the STR sequences of two people are compared with each other. If the patterns are the same, the two people are definitely related. In the lab, the moment of truth. The DNA comparison revealed that the unknown man E was in fact a biological son of Ramses. He was one of the conspirators who perpetrated the assassination of the last great Egyptian pharaoh, and he suffered an agonizing punishment for it. When the scientists opened his sarcophagus, a monstrous stench escaped, which left them holding their breath.
He wasn't properly mummified because he was someone who was a wrongdoer, and the position of his head and neck and so on might be because he hanged himself, because the option of suicide was given to these people.
A mother who wanted to see her son on the throne, and a son who joined a plot against his own father. And so, the mystery of the murder of Ramses III was solved. But there was still one incongruity left to clear up. According to reports in the court papyrus in Turin, Ramses III was present at the trials of the conspirators. How could that be if they had succeeded in killing him?
The dead always have power. They have agency. So even though Ramses might be dead, you would refer to him in a sort of almost living way because A, that's polite, and B, it is not good PR to say that your pharaohs are getting murdered.
Even though the Egyptians have remained silent on the murder of Ramses III, modern science has now confirmed without a doubt that the last great pharaoh of Egypt was in fact assassinated. In a peat bog, a corpse was discovered that turned out to have no fewer than 3 deadly injuries. What was behind the mysterious murder? The British Isles in antiquity. At that time, the majority of the country was under Roman rule, including the peat bog called Lindow Moss. It is a remote and secluded place, as if made for gruesome criminal acts. Time and again, bog bodies have been found there. One of the most famous of them is the corpse known as Lindow Man. His death still baffles scientists today. That's why weapons expert Mike Loades had come to the site. Here, he hoped to reconstruct the exact circumstances surrounding the death of the man from the moss. First, he inspected the area.
This is Lindow Moss. This is where Lindow Man was found. It's an ancient landscape. It's a peat bog. Peat is this organic material that decays over the years. When you dry it, it becomes fuel to make fires. It's a very spooky place. The archaeologists call Lindow Man peat marsh. It's a joke on the word peat, and this is a sort of marshland. But it makes him a real person.
Lindow Man is now the UK's most famous bog body. But who was the dead man?
And when you've seen him, when you've looked into that human face, even though he's 2,000 years old, he is us. Evolution doesn't happen that quickly. He's very recognizable, and his contorted, distorted, anguished features are like that painting by Edvard Munch, like The Scream. It is an agony of mankind, and that is why he is so meaningful to us.
Since his discovery, Lindow Man has made headlines worldwide, though at first the find didn't appear to have the makings of an archaeological sensation. In 1984, peat cutters made an unusual discovery in the Lindow Moss peat bog. A reporter took an interest in the case.
Where exactly was the foot found then?
On that side there.
Oh, down here?
Where that clod is.
Yeah.
And I said, Dan, yesterday we found something there. Took it out and he chucked it over here and it landed here. And this shovel is. And I said, it's a foot, part of a leg.
Shortly afterwards, further excavations brought the torso of the corpse to light. The pathologists first assumed that the dead man from the bog was recently deceased. As long as the cause of death was undetermined, the corpse would be secured at the local police morgue. But then, the experts took a sample from the body and used it to date the find. Even then, radiocarbon analysis was already in common practice, and the procedure delivered a sensational result. Lindow Man, as the man from the bog had been christened, was 2,000 years old. More than 30 years have passed since then. The specimen now lies in the British Museum in London, safely behind glass.
Lindow Man is the best preserved bog body from England. And so, of course, compared to most of the people that we find from over 2,000 years ago in Britain or around 2,000 years ago, he is in incredibly good condition. That starts to give us some clues about who he was, how he lived, his state of health, and also, of course, how he died.
The bog body was given an X-ray examination. That revealed that the lower body had not been severed violently. It had presumably just been lost to the peat bog over time. The remaining bones identified Lindow Man as a male about 1.70 meters tall. Researchers estimated his age at death to be roughly 30. And they noticed something else, too.
He seems to have been young and healthy, and his fingernails, like one that you can see here, are very finely filed. We don't know that much about the society in which Lindow Man lived in terms of how it was organised, but all of these are suggesting that he's somebody probably of quite high status in his community, certainly someone who hasn't been doing heavy work in the weeks leading up to his death.
In contrast to his well-groomed extremities, researchers also discovered brutal injuries on the body of Lindow Man.
So the most serious injury to Lindow Man's body is this very large area of damage here, right on just on the top of his head. And you can see that the way that the skin is cut and also some fragments of bone here. But there's no doubt that a lot of this damage here on the top of his head has been inflicted around the time that he died. And he seems to have been hit in the head with something with a sharp edge, but quite a large body, so perhaps the tip of an axe. And this is undoubtedly one of the things that contributed to his death.
And the bog body displayed other severe injuries as well. Across the throat, forensic pathologists found a cut wound about 6 centimeters long. The victim also had a strange rope around his neck.
The other object which was found on Lindow Man's body is a little bit more mysterious. So this is a necklace, a piece of sinew that's tied very closely around his neck. And we can see here the image of that and the little knot where it's carefully tied and trimmed at the end. All seems to suggest that there was something more going on than a casual murder.
Back at Lindow Moss, the inhospitable terrain where the victim had spent the last hours of his life. Weapons expert Mike Loades was joined by a stuntman to reconstruct the probable murder scenario. What exactly had happened 2,000 years ago in the bog?
This is where it happened. This is Lindow Moss. Have you ever seen Lindow Man?
No, never, no.
I mean, it's an extra, he's 2,000 years old. He died in such a horrible way, and that's what I want to use you to explore, because he was garroted, he had his throat cut, he had his head smashed in, he's got his ribs broken, and I think you're just a chap to try that with. So let's get down to the moss, let's get down to where it actually happened. It's kind of spooky, go into the real place, but this is real. This is where he died. So if this was just a regular assassination or a robbery, then with a bit of string like this, I could simply get round and strangle him. The trouble is, in that situation, he would struggle. He could fight back at me like that, and then we're into a real problem.
If the murderer had tried to strangle his victim with a loose piece of rope, it would have been hard to maintain the necessary pressure. But the perpetrator had attacked Lindow Man with a specially knotted cord.
So I think something else happened. Don't forget, we have this loop at one end. It had another loop at the other end, and it was crossed over. What if I put a bit of stick through one of those knots? Now we've got something more elaborate, but it's going to take more time. So if this is a ritual sacrifice, then we have time. We could use a weapon like this to club him, to get him down to the ground. Now I've got plenty of time to get the stick in position and then start twisting and twisting. Now we have a ritual sacrifice. And can you see how this knot is now bearing down on his neck? I've only hit him lightly. If he's beginning to gain consciousness now, then I can use this as a lever, give a real jerk against his neck. There. Now maybe, just maybe, that's what broke those ribs, what may have fractured those ribs. So we're killing him in several ways. We've clubbed him. We are garroting him. As a byproduct, he's had his ribs broken. Maybe he struggles a little bit more. Well, then I just bring a knee in to stop that. Maybe that's what fractured the rib.
The scenario that Mike Loades reconstructed showed clear premeditation. The perpetrator knew exactly what he was doing. He had first knocked his victim unconscious so that he could then strangle him without a struggle. He had possibly also broken the defenseless man's neck at this point too, but the attack wasn't over yet.
But they also wanted to take another life force, his blood. His arteries would now, from the strangulation, be bulging forward, and they just laid a knife on and then cut his throat. And we have evidence for that.
The slitting of the throat was presumably the climax of a brutal ritual. The murderer killed his victim threefold: by strangulation, breaking his neck, and cutting his throat. Forensic specialists refer to this as overkill.
Clearly it is overkill, but we can explain it. The garroting, that is taking away a man's breath, the very symbol of existence. The knife is letting their blood. Again, a very symbol of life. And then there is another bit of evidence. On the skull, apart from the injuries from a club, there is a perfect square puncture wound. And that, I think, was the final blow. And I think they stabbed it into his head, killing his brain. So that's why it's overkill. It's a triple kill, looking at three elements of existence. Robert, however, is perfectly fine and unharmed, and thank you very much, my friend. You did great.
Weapons expert Mike Loades' reconstruction of the crime makes the case for a ritual murder. But what do anthropologists think of this theory?
2 forensic anthropologists looked at Lindow Man's remains after he was discovered in the 1980s, and they came up with 2 different theories about how he died. One saw a lot of injuries on Lindow Man's body and thought it was most likely that this kind of overkill suggested that Lindow Man was a human sacrifice. But the other thought that the injury that was most likely was the damage to the back of the head, and that it's possible that Lindow Man's death was just something like a robbery gone wrong.
Ritual sacrifice or armed robbery? How did Lindow Man lose his life? To answer this question, scientists needed to positively identify the victim. Who was Lindow Man? What role had he played in society? In today's terms, what line of work was he in? In ancient times, Celtic tribes settled Europe from Spain to France and all the way up to the British Isles. That changed in the last century before Christ when the Romans, coming up from the south, began to supplant the Celts. But their advance hit a speed bump when they got to Britannia. There, the Roman legions met with fierce resistance from the Celts. Bloody battles frequently erupted. The Celts also put up such resistance because their druid priests had sworn their community to remain tight-knit. To appease the gods, the spiritual leaders offered them animal and even human sacrifices. These rituals were a thorn in the side of the Romans. Wherever they conquered Celtic territory, they promptly forbade the druids to practice their rituals. But what does all that have to do with the murder of Lindow Man? Could he have been a Celtic druid who had been executed for defying the Romans' ban?
When the Romans are going to execute someone in the provinces and the territories, there are typical ways in which they conduct this. They can burn you alive, they can crucify you and throw you to the wild animals, chop your head off, and it's kind of like a one-off, and oftentimes for public enjoyment. But it doesn't really fit within the playbook to do kind of a multiple killing. You're just going to carry out execution once. The Lindow Man, of course, his multiple executions is quite unusual for the Roman perspective.
So a Roman execution was deemed highly unlikely. Could it be that Lindow Man was actually killed by members of the Celtic community? To get to the bottom of this issue, scientists would now inspect the bog body's stomach contents. Would the last meal that Lindow Man ate while alive reveal evidence of the specific circumstances of his death?
It seems that one of the last things he ate was charred bread. And we also found evidence for a few grains of mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe is written about by Roman authors as this special magical plant. So it's possible that Lindow Man could have ingested some of that mistletoe intentionally before he died.
Then as now, mistletoe was a plant thought to have magical healing properties. Scientists interpreted Lindow Man's ingestion of it shortly before death as evidence of ritual sacrifice. The subsequent pollen analysis pointed in the same direction, because the victim's intestines contained pollen only from plants that bloom in April. At that time, the Celts celebrated their most important religious rite. The tradition still lives on today in the Beltane Festival, held in the night from April the 30th to May the 1st. For instance, here in Edinburgh in Scotland. The people gather, as did their ancestors of yore, to celebrate the end of the long winter and the victory of the sun over the powers of darkness. Could it be that 2,000 years ago in the Lindow Moss, a man was sacrificed as a part of this rite of spring? There is much evidence to support this theory.
Another fact which makes perhaps the human sacrifice theory more likely and something like a murder gone wrong seem less likely is that Lindow Man isn't the only body that's been found in Lindow Moss. There are actually at least 3, possibly remains of 4 people from around about the same time, some of whom seem to have died in a similar way.
Assuming Lindow Man really was killed in a ritual sacrifice, a question still remains. Did he go to his death voluntarily?
It's interesting to think that perhaps Lindow Man knows that he's going to be either executed or sacrificed. So really it just leaves us to wonder and imagine if this is a planned death and execution or something that was a surprise to Lindow Man.
Though science has already revealed much about the murder of Lindow Man, the true backstory to his death will most likely remain forever obscured. Archaeologists discovered the skeletons of 13 people in a grave. Most of them had met a violent death. What was behind the mass murder? Eulau, in the south of the German state of Saxony-Anhalt, now on the outskirts of the historic city of Naumburg. On a reconnaissance flight in 2005, head archaeologist of Saxony-Anhalt Harald Meller spotted remarkable circles in the fields below.
They look like burial pits.
Dark spots in a field. That's how it all began. Harald Meller was intrigued. He wanted to find out just what those dark spots were and ordered an excavation of the site. His team quickly hit pay dirt. They were, in fact, ancient grave sites. 13 people had been buried at the site. 2 men, 3 women, and 8 children. And something else was obvious at first sight. Most of them had met a violent death. The State Museum of Prehistory in Halle. Here, the human remains from the grave site at Eulau are displayed. Head archaeologist Harald Meller explains what they've found out in the meantime about the lethal wounds found on the bodies of the dead.
Basically, 2 types of weapon were used to kill the victims: battle axes and arrows. The pattern of the arrow shots and the hatchet blows to the skull tell us that the wounds were inflicted by skilled warriors who knew exactly what they were doing.
To pinpoint the century in which the victims had lived and died, bone samples were taken from the skeletons. In this dating procedure, the bone is ground fine, then frozen solid with liquid nitrogen. The frozen bone is then heated until it reaches a gaseous state. Finally, it is analyzed in a mass spectrometer. The result in this case was clear. The people buried in the pits had lived 4,500 years ago. The tribes that had settled in Eulau back then lived from livestock and agriculture. Known in specialist circles as corded wares people, they pressed lengths of rope into their pottery goods to create a typical grooved pattern. The corded wares culture developed in Central Europe on the cusp of the Stone Age to the early Bronze Age, that is, at a time when the Egyptians had already built pyramids. But unlike the high cultures on the Nile, the corded wares people lived together in small groups of less than 100 people. Life in a corded wares community was surely not without social conflicts. But it is highly improbable that a disagreement of that kind would have ended in the brutal massacre of multiple group members. Further evidence that the cause of death was not a violent conflict in the community is the way the bodies were buried.
The corpses were laid to rest in the grave in the form of a purposeful presentation. It shows the close family connections and also the heavy blow that the community was dealt by this horrific act.
It seems the surviving members of the community had buried the victims in a manner that was also an expression of sincere mourning. The positioning in the grave piqued archaeologists' curiosity. The dead were buried so closely that their bodies touched. They lay looking at each other with an almost tender gaze. But why? A DNA test would hopefully answer the question. The archaeologists suspected that the dead could be members of the same family. DNA profiles of the skeletons would let them know for sure.
The genomic information can be found inside the nucleus, where we have in total 46 chromosomes. And whereas one half is inherited from our mother, the other half is inherited from our father.
The comparison of the DNA profiles left no room for doubt. Buried in one of the graves was, in fact, a nuclear family. Father, mother, and 2 children.
The Eulau burial site has the oldest confirmed family graves known worldwide to date. The special thing is the one case where we have definitive genetic proof of a nuclear family. In other words, a modern family concept that wasn't necessarily the norm in the past.
The discovery was an archaeological sensation. Not only was this the oldest known grave of a nuclear family, it was also the oldest known murder of a nuclear family. But who were the perpetrators? An important piece of evidence was found in the spine of another skeleton.
We see here an arrowhead in the 4th lumbar vertebrae. It penetrated with enormous force, right at the spot where the main aorta is. And when that tears, death comes very quickly indeed. That was a real kill shot.
The lumbar vertebra was subjected to a CT scan to inspect the projectile more closely. The image clearly revealed a projectile in the form of a trapezoid. The Stone Age projectile was unusual. Instead of a sharp point like a normal arrowhead, it had a flat-edged tip, more like a chisel. How had this ancient arrowhead been made? Jürgen Jungmanns is an expert for Stone Age weapons and is very familiar with such projectiles.
A special feature is that the blade is flat here on top. But it still has the same effect as a regular arrowhead. It tears open a big hole and cuts deep into the flesh.
The weapons expert demonstrated how a chisel edge like this is made. First, a few blade pieces are hammered from a flint stone, and then other hand tools are used to give the blanks the right shape. As we see, a skilled craftsman needs only minutes to produce a knife-sharp projectile. But every arrowhead needs an arrow. Jungmanns is a dab hand at that too. The arrowhead must then be firmly affixed to the arrow.
Birch tar is Stone Age superglue, made from birch bark. It's tar, so basically a hot glue.
And then, the arrow, complete with chisel edge tip, was finished. But what are the advantages of this type of weapon? An archery test would tell us. Jürgen Jungmanns joined forces with weapons expert Mike Loades to compare the effect of the chisel edge with that of a pointed arrow.
So you have been making replicas of archery equipment?
Yeah, I've been quite busy.
You know, Jürgen, one of the things that fascinates me about Eulau is we have these 2 different types of arrowhead. We know that in the bodies were this type, this flat chisel head, but we also know that the Eulau people used this type of arrowhead. What I would really like to see is if there is a difference in performance I would like to see you shoot these against some ballistic gel and perhaps through some leather to see if one cuts better than the other.
The marksman was ready. Jonkman's first shot was with the chisel edge arrowhead. The target was a dummy torso made of ballistic gelatin, which mimics the characteristics of the human body. The chisel edge arrowhead bored deep into the chest.
Hey, good shot. That's gone in nicely. Let's see what this one does.
Then the comparison shot. Jürgen Jonkman's now shot a pointed arrowhead. How would it do in comparison to the chisel edge tip?
Okay, let's see what's happened here. Very interesting. That's the chisel head.
Yes, yes, yes.
I'm going to pull them out, and I want to see if there's any difference in depth.
All right.
So I'm going to put my thumb there, and I won't move it. Take this anymore. That is how much penetration. So if you imagine the arrowhead was to there. Yeah, it might have hit, well, we'll have a look in a minute. Yeah. Might have hit about, and then this one, and you can take this one out. But what you can see, there's a slightly bigger tear here. That wider arrowhead has torn the skin a little bit more. So, you know, this person is bleeding a little bit more. I'm going to take this skin off and see if we can get a better look at what's going on in here. And we can. Look at this, Jürgen. You can see how it's gone between two ribs.
Yes.
And that cutting edge has cut that rib.
Yeah.
It's sawn its way through the bone. But what's going on over here? I'm going to put this back onto the arrowhead. You know, we know it went in that deep. So this went in that deep. It didn't cut through the bone like that did. But don't forget, this took 3 minutes to make, and this is the arrowhead that killed the people at Eulau.
So the advantage of the chisel edge arrowhead is that a larger number of them can be produced in a shorter time period than the normal pointed type. That would explain why the Eulau murderers used it. But who were the murderers? The chisel edge would also help here. The scientists compared it with arrowhead finds from other regions. The result was clear.
The arrowheads used here were from a completely different culture, one that came from north of the Harz Mountains. When we study them forensically, like a modern bullet, these arrowheads give us clues about the perpetrators back then.
The chisel edge arrowhead proved the perpetrators belonged to the Schönfeld culture, a people that had settled in the Harz region about 70 kilometers from the crime scene in Eulau. But what were the Schönfelders doing in Eulau? Were they out to conquer new settlement areas? It's quite plausible that the incident arose from a territorial conflict with one tribe planning to attack the other for their turf. But Harald Meller had another idea.
One of the possible motives for this act would be if the attackers had in fact been related to the murdered women.
To put this theory to the test, the scientists deployed the whole arsenal of modern forensic diagnostics. The dental enamel of the Eulau dead was subjected to isotope analysis, which would help determine the origins of the victims. People ingest strontium naturally with their food, but the isotope ratios vary depending on geographical location. The element is then stored in the bones and teeth. Storage in the teeth, however, stops in childhood. So the isotope ratio of the strontium atoms in tooth enamel can be used to determine where a person grew up. In the case of the Eulau murders, the isotope analysis led to a surprising plot twist. The adult female victims weren't originally from Eulau. They came from the same region as the perpetrators.
These were women who had either been abducted or went of their own free will and started families with the foreign men in a new homeland. That would be a strong motive for their relatives in the abandoned culture to kill the women.
So the mass murder of Eulau was very likely an act of revenge. One tribe seeking retribution for the theft of their women by another. But not just the abductors were killed. The women, too, and the children they had borne to their new men were also murdered.
This was absolutely not a crime of passion, and it was certainly not a spontaneous act. This was something planned well in advance. They would first have to approach the village unnoticed. There were dogs, perhaps other animals that would sound the alarm. They would have to creep up and wait until most of the villagers had gone off, leaving the most vulnerable group behind as easy prey for the attack.
The perpetrators had presumably waited until the able-bodied men had left the village. Then they attacked with brutal force. The defenseless villagers of Eulau didn't stand a chance against the overwhelming power of the aggressors. In the end, the assailants even killed children. And so the mystery of the Eulau murders has been solved. Archaeologists and forensic scientists have succeeded in coaxing the dark secrets out of millennia-old human remains.